For decades, they told you the ladder was there for anyone willing to climb. Work hard, get the degree, buy the stock, retire with dignity. The system's promise to the bottom 99% was a straight line from effort to reward. But there was another promise made, one you never heard, one written in ink so permanent it might as well be carved into the foundation of every bank, every trust, every generational estate. This was the system's unbreakable oath to the top 1%, and you were never part of it. Let's start with a single number. The Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, the most authoritative measure of wealth in America, shows that the top 1% now holds about 31.7% of all household wealth. That is not a peak. It is a plateau they have defended for decades. But here is the number that breaks the official story. The bottom 50% of Americans collectively hold just 2.5% of the nation's wealth. Not a tenth, not a 20th, not even a sliver that could be explained by effort. 2.5% held by more than 160 million people. And the gap is not closing. It is not the result of laziness, poor education, or bad choices. It is the inheritance of a system that makes a solemn vow to those at the top. Your position will be protected. So who is this promise actually designed for? That question opens the first loop. Because if you look at the numbers honestly, you realize the mainstream story. Work hard, save wisely, invest smart. Cannot explain the distribution we see. The data demands a different explanation, and the data always wins. Now stop and consider what they told you about the 1950s, the golden age of the middle class, they call it. Strong unions, high taxes on the rich, a booming manufacturing sector. And it was real, for a time. The top marginal income tax rate in the 1950s was 91%. 91% on every dollar, earned above a certain threshold. That rate did not kill the economy. It funded the interstate highway system, the GI Bill, the space program. It compressed the wealth distribution. In 1965, the ratio of CEO pay to typical worker pay was about 21-1. The top 1% held about 30% of wealth then, but the middle class was growing, and the bottom 90% held more than a third. That was Timeline A, a system with specific rules, high marginal taxes, strong collective bargaining, a financial sector that was dull and heavily regulated. The wealthy still existed, but the mechanism forced capital to circulate. It was not a utopia. Racial exclusion, gender discrimination, environmental damage were all embedded. But the wealth distribution was vastly more equal than today. And the people at the top still made their oath. They just had to wait. Now shift to Timeline B, the modern era. The top marginal tax rate has fallen to 37%, plus about 3.8% for the net investment income tax. Still, under 41%, less than half of what it was 70 years ago. The CEO to worker ratio. By 2023, it hit 290-1. The top 1% now hold nearly a third of all wealth, as we saw, but the bottom 50% have been squeezed to under 3%. The Gini coefficient, which measures inequality on a scale from 0 to 1, rose from about 0.4 in 1970 to over 0.48 in 2020. That is not a small drift. It is a fundamental shift in how the economy distributes its rewards. If you have ever watched your paycheck buy less each year while the stock market sets new records, you know the quiet anger of the promise clashing with reality. That is the gap these numbers measure. Now here is the surprising part. When you overlay timeline A and timeline B, when you chart the wealth share of the top 1% decade by decade, you find something unexpected. The share did not stay constant, but the top 1%'s grip never fully loosened. In the 1950s and 1960s, they held roughly 25 to 30%. After the Reagan tax cuts and financial deregulation, their share climbed to 35% by the late 1990s. After the 2008 financial crisis and the quantitative easing that followed, it climbed again, reaching the current 31.7%. The rich lost ground in the post-war boom only to regain and exceed it in the last 40 years. The pattern is not random. It is the result of specific policy choices, each one reinforcing the central oath. The hidden constant across both eras is intergenerational earnings elasticity. Economists use this term to measure how much a child's income depends on their parents' income. In the United States, that elasticity is about 0.5. That means if your parents earned twice the average, you are likely to earn about 50% more than the average. In a perfectly mobile society, that number would be near 0. In a caste society, it would be near 1. America sits in the middle, but the trend is toward the caste end, not the mobile one. A 2018 study from the Equality of Opportunity Project found that a child born into the bottom quintile in the 1970s had about an 8% chance of reaching the top quintile. By the 1990s birth cohort, that number had fallen. Mobility has declined, not improved, despite the explosion of college degrees and financial products. Now overlay the two charts, the top 1%'s wealth share and the intergenerational earnings elasticity. Both move in the same direction over the same period. The system that sold you the dream of meritocracy was simultaneously making the dream less possible. That is not a contradiction. That is the mechanism in plain sight. The mechanism that connects both eras is not change, but a designed stability, masked as change. In the 1950s, the wealthy paid high taxes, but they also held enormous capital in trusts, foundations, and corporate structures that could survive the tax regime. They adapted. When the top rate was cut in the 1980s, they accelerated, moved income into capital gains, shifted assets offshore, poured money into political campaigns to make the cuts permanent. Each era looks different, but the underlying promise to the top 1% remains. Your position will be defended. Your wealth will be preserved. Your children will inherit your place in the hierarchy. If you have ever felt like the goalposts moved faster than you could run, this is the axis they shifted along. It was not your effort that changed. It was the distance between effort and reward engineered out of reach. If you have felt the distance between effort and reward growing, that is not your imagination. That is the elasticity at work, engineered out of reach. Subscribe to keep uncovering the mechanisms hidden in plain sight, the ones that reshape the game while you are told the rules have not changed. Drop elasticity in the comments if you have felt that gap widen in your own life, and let me know when you first sensed the goalposts had moved. Here is the self-recognition trigger. If you have ever wondered why working twice as hard only keeps you in place, why the degree your parents said would guarantee security now feels like a minimum requirement, why the retirement your grandparents enjoyed seems unattainable on your current trajectory, that is the elasticity at work. The system is not broken. It is working exactly as redesigned. The floor was lowered, the ceiling was raised, and the ladder was smoothed for those already at the top. Now let's get specific about the mechanism. One of the most powerful tools is the stepped-up basis in the capital gains tax. When an asset is inherited, the tax code resets its cost basis to the value at the time of inheritance, not the original purchase price. That means the capital gains accumulated during the original owner's lifetime are never taxed. A family that bought stock in 1950 for $10,000, worth $10 million when inherited in 2025, pays zero capital gains tax on the $9,990,000 of appreciation. The original owner was never forced to sell, and the heir inherits a clean slate. This provision costs the Treasury an estimated $40 to $60 billion per year in lost revenue, almost entirely benefiting the top 1%. Combine that with the estate tax exemption, which in 2025 allows a single person to pass up to approximately $13 million free of federal estate tax, and a married couple to pass nearly $27 million. Only about 1 in 1,000 estates pays any estate tax at all. The rest pass intact, generation after generation, with no interruption from the tax code. Now add the preferential tax rate on capital gains and qualified dividends, capped at 23.8%, including the net investment income tax, compared to the top ordinary income rate of 37% plus payroll taxes. Someone earning $1 billion through stock appreciation pays a lower effective tax rate than a middle-class family earning $150,000 a year through salary. The wage earner pays income tax, payroll tax, state tax, sales tax. The billionaire pays the capital gains rate only when they choose to sell, and often never sells. They borrow against the stock instead, creating tax-free cash while the asset continues to appreciate. This is the core gear, the tax code, the estate planning industry. The lobbying machine that writes the next round of rules combine into a self-reinforcing cycle. Wealth buys access to politicians who write favorable tax laws, which protect and grow wealth, which buys more access. The mechanism assumes you start inside it. If you start outside, every rule is designed to keep you there. The system's unbreakable oath to the top 1% is not a conspiracy in the sense of a secret meeting in a smoke-filled room. It is a structural reality, baked into the code of the economy itself. Every law, every regulation, every tax provision was written by people who were either already wealthy or funded by those who were. The oath is implicit but ironclad. We will ensure that the wealth accumulated in one generation remains in the hands of the next generation, with as little redistribution as possible. Now consider the implications for your own life. If the mechanism is real, then the advice you heard, cut expenses, invest in the market, buy a home, get a degree, is not wrong per se, but it is incomplete in a crucial way. It assumes you are playing a game where the rules are the same for everyone. They are not. The person who inherits $1 million trust pays no tax on that inheritance, while the person who saves $100,000 from their salary pays income tax twice. Once on the earnings, once on the investment returns. The mechanism is not neutral. If you have ever felt like you are doing everything right and still falling behind, that feeling is not a personal failure. It is a rational response to a system that was designed to produce that outcome for people who start outside the top tier. The goal was never to eliminate your effort. The goal was to channel it in directions that do not threaten the hierarchy. You work hard, you consume, you invest in the stock market as a passive participant, and the top 1% uses your labor and your savings to compound their own wealth faster than you can accumulate yours. This is where the evidence anchors tighten. The Federal Reserve's 2022 Survey of Consumer Finances showed that the top 1% held assets worth an average of about $40 million. The next 9% held about $3.5 million. The bottom 50% held less than $60,000. The majority of that bottom half's wealth is in the form of home equity and retirement accounts, two assets that are illiquid, subject to market risk, and often untouchable without penalty. The top 1%'s wealth is dominated by publicly traded stock, private equity, and real estate. Assets they can leverage, borrow against, and pass to heirs with minimal tax consequences. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is a recent example of the oath in action. The corporate tax rate was cut from 35% to 21%. But the individual tax cuts for most Americans are set to expire after 2025. The estate tax exemption was doubled, but that expansion also sunsets. The provisions that primarily benefit the top 1%, lower corporate taxes, the pass-through deduction for wealthy business owners, the expansion of the estate exemption, were made permanent or nearly so, while the middle-class tax cuts have an expiration date. That is not a coincidence. That is the oath being honored. Now apply this to your own financial decisions. If you are saving for retirement in a 401k, you are investing in the same stock market where the top 1% hold the majority of shares. Your returns are subject to the same capital gains treatment, but your nest egg is a fraction of the size, and you cannot access it without penalty until retirement age. Meanwhile, the wealthy can borrow against their assets at low interest rates, use the proceeds to buy more assets, and pay no tax on the loan because it is not income. They can time their capital gains realizations to minimize taxes. They can donate appreciated stock to donor-advised funds, deduct the full market value, and never pay the capital gains tax. Every one of these strategies is legal. Every one of them requires a minimum wealth level that the bottom 90% will never reach. The uncomfortable clarity that emerges is this: the game was never fair, and it was not designed to be fair. The promise that hard work alone would guarantee upward mobility was a narrative, not a description of reality. The data on wealth concentration, intergenerational elasticity, tax treatment, and political influence all point to the same conclusion. The system's primary function is to preserve the wealth and status of those who already have it. But here is the quiet empowerment that follows the discomfort. If you know the mechanism, you can stop blaming yourself. You can stop chasing the dream they sold you and start asking different questions. What would it mean to build financial resilience outside the normal rules? What would it mean to focus on local, tangible assets rather than hoping the stock market will float you into the top 10%? What would it mean to support policies that actually break the feedback loop? Wealth taxes, higher inheritance taxes, stricter campaign finance limits, more progressive income tax brackets. You do not have to beat the system at its own game. You only have to see the board clearly enough to decide where to place your pieces. The oath to the top 1% is real, but it is not invincible. It requires our acceptance to work, and acceptance is a choice. Now pause and notice what has shifted. The promise they sold you, the one about hard work and fair rules and the ladder being there for anyone, was always conditional. It was conditional on you not looking at the actual numbers. It was conditional on you believing that the people at the top earned their position and the people at the bottom deserved theirs. Once you see the data, the condition breaks. You are no longer a willing participant in a story that does not fit the evidence. The crack where the light gets in is this: the same data that reveals the trap also reveals the truth. And the truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. You walk away with the same numbers they used to sell you the dream. Only now you see the crack. Only now you see the crack. And seeing it changes everything about how you move forward. That moment when you see the crack is the moment the entire game shifts. You are no longer playing by their rules because you now see the rules for what they are. Subscribe to keep uncovering the mechanisms they hoped you would never notice, because this channel exists to show you the full board. And right now, in the comments, tell me one thing you now see differently about the system since reading those numbers. That is the first move toward playing your own game. Think about what the system actually demands from you. It demands your belief in the fairness of the game, because belief keeps you playing by the rules that were written for someone else's benefit. It demands your acceptance that the hierarchy is natural, because acceptance prevents you from questioning why the bottom 50% hold less than 3% of the wealth, while the top 1% hold 30 times that. It demands your continued participation in a system where your labor is converted into capital for those above you. And that capital is then used to lobby for rules that extract more value from your labor. The mechanism does not require malice. It requires inertia. It requires that enough people believe the story to keep the machine running. Here is a number that should stop you cold. The top 1% in the United States owns more than half of all corporate equities and mutual fund shares. The bottom 90% collectively own about 12%. When the stock market rises, the vast majority of the gains go to people who already hold the majority of the shares. When the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates or enacts quantitative easing, the new money flows first into financial assets, inflating the portfolios of the wealthy before it ever reaches the real economy. The policy response to the 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 pandemic followed the same pattern. Trillions of dollars injected into the financial system, corporate bond markets, and asset purchases, while direct relief to households was temporary, targeted, and often difficult to access. That is not an accident. That is the oath being honored in real time. The mechanism is visible in every policy response to every crisis of the last 50 years. The wealthy are protected first because they own the assets that the system is designed to protect. The rest are stabilized, just enough to keep the engine running. Now consider what this means for the concept of retirement. The standard advice is to invest in a diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds, contribute regularly to a 401k or IRA, and let compound interest work over decades. That advice works if you have a high income, if you start early, if you avoid market crashes at the wrong moment, and if you do not need to access the money before retirement age. But for the median household, which has less than $10,000 in retirement savings, that advice is not a plan. It is a fantasy sustained by the belief that the system will eventually reward patience. The reality is that the financial system is designed to extract fees, commissions, and management expenses from your savings while providing liquidity and low-cost leverage to the wealthy. The same structure that allows a family office to borrow against its portfolio at one point, 5% interest charges you 5% on a margin loan, if you can get one at all. The same structure that allows the wealthy to time their capital gains, realizations for maximum tax efficiency, forces you to sell when you need cash, regardless of market conditions. The game is not rigged because of individual bad actors. It is rigged because the rules were written by the people who benefit from the current distribution of wealth, and those rules have been refined over generations to ensure that the distribution does not change. Here is the part that most people never hear. The United States is not exceptional in its inequality among developed nations, but it is exceptional in one regard. It has the highest intergenerational earnings elasticity in the developed world. A child born into a low-income family in Denmark has a much higher chance of reaching the top quintile than a child born into a low-income family in the United States. That is not because Danish schools are better, or Danish culture is more egalitarian. It is because the Danish tax and transfer system is more progressive, the inheritance tax is higher, and the political system is less captured by wealth. The mechanism is not universal. It is a product of specific policy choices. The United States chose, through repeated legislative decisions over the last 40 years, to lower taxes on capital, deregulate finance, weaken labor unions, cut social programs, and increase the role of money in politics. Each choice made the oath to the top 1% stronger. Each choice made the ladder harder to climb for everyone else. Now, if you are still reading, something has shifted in your awareness. You are no longer looking at the economy as a neutral system that rewards effort fairly. You are looking at it as a machine that was built with specific intentions and that produces specific outcomes. The question is not whether the machine is fair. The question is what you do now that you see how it works. The quiet empowerment comes from understanding that you are not a failure in a fair game. You are a player in a rigged one. And once you know the game is rigged, you can stop playing by the rules they gave you. What would it look like to build wealth outside the normal channels? What would it mean to invest in assets that do not depend on the same financial infrastructure? Real estate in communities that are not being gentrified. Small businesses that serve local needs. Skills that cannot be automated or outsourced. What would it mean to support cooperative ownership models, credit unions, community land trusts, and other structures that keep wealth circulating within communities rather than flowing upward? These are not romantic alternatives. They are practical responses to a system that is not designed to include you. The wealthy have been using these strategies for centuries. Trusts, foundations, family offices, private equity, to insulate their wealth from the normal rules. The difference is that they had access to the knowledge and the legal infrastructure. You have to build yours from scratch, but the principle is the same. Do not rely on the system that was designed to extract from you. The oath to the top 1% is not a secret. It is written into the tax code, the campaign finance laws, the corporate governance rules, the bankruptcy code, the housing market. It is visible in the fact that the top 1% spend more on lobbying than the entire labor movement spends on political activity. It is visible in the fact that the wealthiest 400 families in the United States now own more wealth than the entire bottom 150 million Americans combined. If that number sounds extreme, it is because it is. The 2021 Forbes 400 list showed that the combined wealth of the 400 richest people was about $4.5 trillion. The bottom 150 million Americans, roughly half the population, held about $3.5 trillion in total wealth in the same year. 400 people versus 150 million people. The oath is not subtle. The mechanism that produces this outcome is not complicated. It is a feedback loop. Wealth buys political influence. Political influence writes favorable rules. Favorable rules protect and grow wealth. Wealth buys more influence. The loop has been running for decades, and it accelerates with each iteration. The only force that has ever interrupted this loop is organized collective action. The labor movement of the 1930s and 1940s forced the creation of the New Deal, which compressed wealth and expanded the middle class. The civil rights movement of the 1960s forced the creation of anti-poverty programs that reduced inequality. The progressive tax rates of the 1950s and 1960s were not a gift from the wealthy. They were a response to political pressure from below. That pressure has been systematically weakened over the last 50 years. Union membership has fallen from about 25% of the workforce in the 1970s to about 10% today. Campaign finance laws have been gutted by Supreme Court decisions, like Citizens United. The media narrative has shifted from covering inequality as a systemic problem to covering it as a matter of individual success or failure. But the data does not change. The mechanism does not disappear just because the narrative shifts. The wealth share of the top 1%, the intergenerational earnings elasticity, the ratio of CEO pay to worker pay, the effective tax rates on capital versus labor. All of these measures tell the same story. The system is designed to produce and reproduce inequality. So what do you do with this knowledge? First, you stop internalizing the failure. You are not behind because you did not save enough, or work hard enough, or make the right investments. You are behind because the game was set up to produce that outcome for people who start outside the top tier. Second, you start looking for the cracks in the mechanism. The same data that shows the trap also shows where the pressure points are. Policies like wealth taxes, higher inheritance taxes, financial transaction taxes, stricter campaign finance rules, stronger labor protections, universal basic services. These are not abstract ideas. They are specific levers that interrupt the feedback loop. Third, you adjust your personal strategy. If the stock market is a vehicle for the wealthy to compound their gains at a faster rate than you can accumulate savings, then you need different vehicles. If the housing market is a mechanism for extracting value from renters and transferring it to landlords and financial institutions, then you need strategies that bypass that extraction. If the education system is a credentialing mechanism that protects the children of the wealthy from competition, then you need skills and networks that are not dependent on those credentials. None of this is easy. None of it is guaranteed. But it is a more honest starting point than the fantasy they sold you. The oath to the top 1% is real. It is structural. It is the default operating system of the American economy. But it is not immutable. Every policy that built it was chosen by human beings, and every policy can be unchosen by human beings. The question is whether enough people will see the mechanism clearly enough to demand change. You are one of the people who now sees it. That is not a small thing. That is the first crack in the wall. And cracks, once they appear, have a way of spreading. You are part of that spread. And the more people who see it, the harder it becomes for the mechanism to remain invisible. Let's linger on one more layer. The oath does not just protect wealth. It actively extracts value from below through mechanisms you are told are neutral. Take the student loan system. The federal government guarantees loans, sets interest rates, and collects payments, but the loans themselves are often serviced by private companies that profit from fees and penalties. The total student loan debt in the United States exceeds $1.7 trillion, held by about 43 million borrowers. The average monthly payment is between $200 and $400. That is money that could have been saved, invested, or spent in the local economy. Instead, it flows upward to the servicers, to the investors who hold the securities backed by those loans, to the universities that have raised tuition far faster than inflation. The mechanism here is subtle. You are told that education was the great equalizer, the one investment that would pay off regardless of background. And for some, it does. But for the millions who borrowed to attend schools that did not provide the promised return, the loan becomes a permanent drag on wealth accumulation. You cannot discharge it in bankruptcy. It follows you for decades. It delays home ownership, retirement savings, and entrepreneurship. It is a wealth transfer from the young and the working class to the institutions and investors at the top. That is the student loan system, doing exactly what it was designed to do: transfer wealth upward under the guise of opportunity. If you want to see how many more of these mechanisms are still waiting to be exposed, subscribe so you don't miss the next layer of the investigation. And in the comments, drop the phrase, "promised return," if you have ever wondered where your payments really went. Now add the housing market. The 30-year fixed-rate mortgage is a remarkable financial innovation. It allowed millions of families to build equity over time. But it also created a mechanism for extracting value from those who cannot access it. Renters pay a premium over the cost of ownership in most markets, and that premium flows to landlords, many of whom are large institutional investors. In 2021 and 2022, investment firms bought more than a quarter of all single-family homes sold in some metropolitan areas. They bid cash, above asking price, and converted family homes into rental properties. The rent then rises faster than wages, and the wealth that would have been built through home equity flows instead to corporate balance sheets. The oath does not just protect existing wealth. It engineers new channels for wealth to flow upward. Consider the healthcare system. The United States spends about $4.5 trillion per year on healthcare, roughly 17% of GDP, far more than any other developed nation. Yet outcomes are worse, and the system is riddled with extraction points. Insurance companies extract profits from premiums. Pharmaceutical companies set prices that are 2 to 3 times higher than in other countries. Hospital systems charge inflated rates to those with private insurance. The result is that medical debt is the leading cause of bankruptcy in the United States, affecting millions of families who did everything right. They worked, they had insurance, they got sick anyway. That debt destroys credit scores, prevents saving, and transfers wealth upward to the shareholders of healthcare corporations. Each of these systems, education, housing, healthcare, sells itself as a path to security. But each operates as a mechanism for extracting value from the bottom 90% and delivering it to the top. The oath is not just about protecting inherited wealth. It is about creating new streams of revenue that flow in the same direction. Now look at the labor market itself. The decline of unions, the rise of at-will employment, the proliferation of non-compete clauses and mandatory arbitration agreements. These are not natural market developments. They are specific policy choices that shift power from workers to employers. When you cannot negotiate collectively, your wages grow more slowly than productivity. When you sign a mandatory arbitration agreement, you waive your right to sue for wage theft, discrimination, or harassment. When you accept a non-compete clause, you cannot leave for a better job in your field without legal risk. The result is that labor's share of national income has fallen from about 64% in the 1970s to about 56% today. That 8 percentage point shift represents about $1.6 trillion per year that once went to wages and now goes to capital. That is the size of the transfer. It is not the result of automation or globalization alone. It is the result of policy choices that weakened labor's bargaining power while strengthening capital's. The mechanism is not abstract. It shows up in your paycheck, in your rent, in your student loan bill, in the cost of your health care. in the non-compete you signed without reading. It is the invisible architecture of your daily life. Here is the uncomfortable truth that follows from all of this evidence. The system is not failing. It is succeeding at exactly what it was designed to do. The top 1% holds a larger share of wealth than at any point since the 1920s. The intergenerational elasticity is high and rising. The tax code favors capital over labor. The political system is captured by money. Every crisis is met with policies that protect assets first and people second. If you measure the system by its stated goals, mobility, fairness, opportunity, it is a catastrophe. If you measure it by its actual function, preserving and concentrating wealth at the top, it is a masterpiece of engineering. That distinction is the crack where the light gets in. Because once you stop judging the system by what it claims to do and start judging it by what it actually does, your relationship to it changes. You stop expecting it to reward you. You stop blaming yourself when it does not. You stop believing that the next tax cut, the next bull market, the next policy reform will finally make it work the way you were promised. Instead, you start asking the only question that matters. Given how the system actually functions, what do I need to do to protect myself and the people I care about? The answers will look different for everyone, but they share a common thread. They stop relying on the system to deliver what it has never delivered. They build resilience outside the normal channels. They focus on local networks, real assets, tangible skills, and collective action. The crack is small, but it is real, and it is spreading. The answers will look different for everyone because the mechanism hits each person at a different angle. For some, it is the student loan payment that never seems to shrink. For others, it is the rent that rises faster than any raise they have ever received. For many, it is the quiet realization that their parents' house, which was supposed to be their inheritance, was sold to pay for nursing home care that drained every dollar of equity. The mechanism adapts. It finds the weak point in every family's financial structure and presses there. But here is what changes when you see the full architecture. You stop treating each setback as an isolated event. You stop blaming yourself for not knowing the right strategy. You stop believing that the next certification, the next promotion, the next market upturn will finally deliver what was promised. You see the pattern behind the individual events, and that pattern is the same at every level. Wealth flows upward, and the rules ensure it keeps flowing. The quiet empowerment that follows is not the kind they sell in personal finance books. It is not a 6-step plan to financial independence or a secret method for beating the market. It is something simpler and more durable. It is the permission to stop running a race you were never meant to win. It is the clarity to allocate your energy toward things that the mechanism cannot extract from you. Knowledge, relationships, skills, local networks, the ability to organize with others who see the same pattern. The system's unbreakable oath to the top 1% has been honored for generations. It will be honored tomorrow. But the people who see the mechanism clearly are no longer participants in the story it tells about itself. They are witnesses. And witnesses, once they have seen, have a way of changing the story by their presence alone. You have seen it now. The numbers are on the table. The contradiction is laid bare. The question is not whether the system will change tomorrow. It will not. The question is what you do with the rest of your life now that you know how the board is arranged. That is the crack. And it is enough